Stone walls and deep rivers could not stop them. The true architects of medieval borders were horse archers from the open plains. Their story is one of breathtaking military innovation, a set of tools and tactics so effective they toppled kingdoms and redrew the map of continents. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the precise mechanics that allowed nomadic empires to reshape the world. How did a bow no longer than a man's arm defeat armies of armored knights? What simple invention turned a rider and his horse into an unstoppable unit of war? This is the hidden engineering behind history's most dramatic conquests. What does true power look like when it refuses to stand still? Think of a world without walls. The defining feature of the Eurasian steppe is a horizon that never ends, a sea of grass stretching from the borders of China to the gates of Europe. This landscape shaped a people as much as any mountain range or fertile river valley ever could. Winters brought bitter cold and deep snow, summers could parch the earth, and survival depended not on settled farms, but on the constant movement of vast herds. In this crucible, every aspect of daily life became a military drill. A child learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk, not for sport, but to help manage the family's livestock, their entire wealth on the hoof. This cultivated a bond between rider and horse that settled cultures could scarcely comprehend. The horse was not merely a tool, it was a partner in survival, an extension of the self. Navigating this featureless terrain honed an innate sense of direction and an ability to read the land for water and pasture, skills that translated directly into battlefield awareness. Life was communal and mobile, with entire societies organized around the rhythms of the herd. This meant that every able-bodied person was, by necessity, a participant in a system of decentralized logistics and mutual defense. When conflict arose, there was no need to conscript an army from farmers. The society itself was the army, already mounted, already supplied by its traveling herds, and already possessing the endurance forged by a lifetime of seasonal migration. The steppe did not just produce warriors, it produced a complete military culture, where the line between civilian and soldier was blurred into non-existence. This was the raw material, the human and animal resource, upon which the brilliant innovations of steppe warfare would be built. But raw endurance alone does not win wars. The true game-changer was a piece of technology so advanced it seemed almost magical to those who faced it. This was the Composite Recurve Bow, a weapon of layered genius. Picture the materials not as simple wood, but as a carefully engineered sandwich. A core of flexible wood provided the shape, backed with resilient animal sinew that acted like a coiled spring, and faced with compressed horn that stored incredible energy when the bow was drawn. This combination of organic components created a synergy far greater than the sum of its parts. The result was a bow short enough to be maneuvered from the saddle of a galloping horse, yet capable of launching an arrow with enough force to pierce armor at distances well over 100 yards. For a knight accustomed to closing to lance length, this was a terrifying new reality. The battlefield was no longer a defined space where two lines met. It was now a lethal zone extending far beyond his reach, controlled entirely by a foe who refused to stand still. The construction of such a bow was an art form passed down through generations, a secret craft that required specific types of wood, horn from certain wild goats, and tendons from particular animals, all cured and laminated with fish bladder glue over many months. This was not mass-produced equipment. It was a bespoke instrument of war as personal to a rider as his own horse. In the hands of a skilled archer, it became something more than a weapon. It was a psychological tool, a force multiplier that allowed a single nomadic warrior to harass, wound, and demoralize an entire column of enemy troops long before they could even think of mounting a charge. The composite bow didn't just change how battles were fought, it redefined where and when they could even begin. Yet a bow, no matter how powerful, is useless if you cannot aim it. The final piece of the puzzle was not a weapon at all, but a simple pair of metal or wooden rings hanging from the saddle. To the untrained eye, the stirrup seems almost trivial, a basic convenience for mounting a horse. For the steppe warrior, it was the unsung hero that completed a revolution in mounted combat. Before its widespread adoption, a rider relied solely on the strength of his legs and balance of his torso to stay atop a moving horse, especially during the violent motions of a gallop or a sharp turn. The stirrup changed everything by providing a solid, stable platform. It allowed the rider to rise from the saddle, bracing his weight against the stirrups to absorb the horse's movement, freeing his upper body from the constant work of staying upright. This was the physical anchor that made the horse archer's deadly dance possible. With his feet securely anchored, a warrior could twist at the waist to shoot arrows to the side, or even perform the legendary Parthian shot, turning completely in the saddle to loose arrows backward at a pursuing enemy, all while at a full gallop. The stability went beyond archery. In the frantic chaos of close combat, a rider could now deliver a spear thrust or a sword slash with the full force of his body, putting the momentum of the horse behind the blow without fear of being unhorsed by the impact. He could lean far out to strike an opponent on the ground or recover instantly from a missed swing. The horse and rider were no longer two separate entities, one carrying the other. The stirrup fused them into a single, stable combat unit, a centaur of flesh, bone, and steel. This simple innovation meant that for the first time, cavalry was not just mobile infantry, it was a qualitatively different kind of force, capable of complex maneuvers and sustained fire that a standing army could neither match nor escape. The stirrup provided the foundation upon which the entire terrifying edifice of steppe warfare was built. The final element was not a weapon, but a living, breathing partner in this system of conquest. The steppe horse was the ultimate strategic asset, the empire's true engine. Often smaller and sturdier than the tall European destriers bred for the weight of a knight in full armor, these animals were a masterpiece of practical adaptation. They were bred not for a single magnificent charge, but for relentless endurance, for speed over long distances, and most importantly, for an ability to thrive where other horses would starve. Their digestive systems were marvels of efficiency, capable of extracting nourishment from the tough, sparse grasses of the plains, even breaking through winter snow with their hooves to find forage beneath. This biological resilience translated directly into a staggering military advantage. While a European army marched at the speed of its slowest supply wagon, burdened by long, vulnerable lines of grain and fodder, a steppe force moved with its entire world. Families, herds, and all their possessions traveled together, a mobile city on the hoof. The army's logistics were not a separate concern, they were its very way of life. The horses themselves provided the supply line, living off the land as they went. This meant a steppe army could appear with shocking speed from an unexpected direction, sustain itself in hostile territory indefinitely, and vanish back into the grasslands before a lumbering opponent could even muster a response. The horse was far more than just a mount. It was a source of nourishment, providing mare's milk, a staple of the nomadic diet, and in times of extreme hardship, a reserve of sustenance. It was the primary means of transportation for every person, from the youngest child to the eldest elder. And of course, it was the platform for that devastating tactical superiority we have already seen. This fusion of warrior, bow, stirrup, and horse created a force that was entirely self-sufficient and rapidly deployable. They were not an army that invaded a territory. They were an entire society that simply arrived, bringing their borders with them in the form of their herds and their tents. How do you defeat an enemy that has no cities to besiege, no supply lines to cut, and no fixed territory to defend? For the settled kingdoms of the medieval world, this was not just a tactical challenge, it was an existential puzzle. This system of tools and horses was directed by a mind that thought in motion. The signature tactic of the steppe was not a head-on collision, but a brilliant act of theater, a psychological operation performed at a gallop. Historians call it the feigned retreat, but that simple name hides a complex and deadly ballet. A smaller contingent of horse archers would surge forward, unleashing a storm of arrows to provoke the enemy. Then, as if overwhelmed, they would suddenly wheel their horses and flee, appearing to scatter in panic and disarray. To a defending commander, this was an irresistible sight. His disciplined ranks had weathered the missile storm, and now the enemy was breaking. The order would ring out to give chase, to crush the fleeing cowards. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. The pursuit itself was the weapon. As the enemy knights or infantry charged forward, their formations inevitably stretched and broke apart, driven by the heat of the moment and the desire for a decisive victory. They were lured away from their fortified positions, their supporting units, and into open ground chosen in advance by their opponents. Then, with a signal unseen by the pursuers, the fleeing riders would suddenly turn, their discipline instantly restored. They were no longer prey, but the anvil. At that same moment, fresh units of cavalry, hidden until now in folds of terrain or behind distant hills, would erupt onto the flanks and rear of the overextended enemy, becoming the hammer. The pursuing force found itself completely encircled, compressed into a chaotic mass where their numbers meant nothing, and subjected to a continuous, whirling storm of arrows from all sides. It was a perfect kill box. This maneuver did not just exploit terrain, it exploited human nature. It turned an opponent's courage into recklessness, their discipline into a fatal rigidity. It required unbelievable trust and coordination from every rider involved, each man playing his part in a deadly script where a misstep meant actual disaster. For settled armies used to set peace battles on familiar ground, this fluid, deceptive style of warfare was utterly disorienting. How do you strategize against an enemy whose greatest trick is making you believe you have already won? The answer for centuries was that you often could not. The most brilliant strategy is worthless if an army cannot command itself. While settled kingdoms often relied on rigid chains of command, where orders traveled slowly down a strict hierarchy, the steppe empires mastered a different kind of control. Their leadership structure was as fluid and adaptable as their tactics on the battlefield. At the top stood the great Khan, a unifying figure of immense authority, but his genius lay in knowing he could not micromanage a war fought across thousands of miles of open terrain. Instead, he empowered a circle of trusted commanders, often his own sons or proven generals from loyal clans, each granted significant autonomy. These leaders commanded large, self-contained units called tumans, formations of roughly 10,000 warriors that moved and fought as independent armies. This decentralization was a force multiplier. While a European king might struggle to coordinate a single massive host, a steppe Khan could dispatch multiple tumans to strike several targets simultaneously, stretching defenders to a breaking point across an entire continent. Coordination across these vast distances was achieved through a sophisticated, low-tech communication network. Signal flags of specific colors and patterns could convey basic commands visible across the rolling plains. Drums and horns carried coded messages on the wind, cutting through the noise of battle. And most importantly, a dedicated corps of relay riders, stationed at regular intervals, could carry detailed orders with astonishing speed, creating a living nervous system for the empire. This system prized ability over ancestry. a warrior who demonstrated sharp instincts, courage, and loyalty in the heat of combat could rise rapidly through the ranks, regardless of his family name. This meritocracy meant the army was constantly renewing its leadership with the most capable minds, avoiding the stagnation that could plague hereditary noble officer corps. The true resilience of this model revealed itself in the chaos of defeat. If a commanding general fell in battle, authority did not dissolve. The next most senior and capable officer within that tumen would immediately assume command, and the unit would continue to fight. The army could suffer a loss and yet not shatter, reconstituting itself around its surviving leaders like water flowing around a stone. This fluid hierarchy meant the steppe war machine was not just powerful, it was remarkably durable, capable of absorbing shocks that would cripple a more rigid adversary. How do you defeat a leadership structure that is designed to bend, not break? For many medieval kingdoms, the answer became tragically clear only when it was far too late. The most terrifying aspect of their power was its utter self-sufficiency. Where a European king saw an army, a steppe Khan saw his entire nation on the march. This logistical mastery was the silent engine behind every conquest, a system so elegantly simple it rendered the complex baggage trains of settled empires obsolete. Picture not a column of supply wagons, but a living, breathing river of livestock, sheep, goats, cattle, and most importantly, horses flowing across the landscape alongside the warriors. Every fighter was his own quartermaster. He typically rode with a string of several horses, rotating them to ensure each animal stayed fresh over immense distances, and he drew his sustenance directly from the herd he guided. His meal might be a slab of dried meat from his saddlebag, or a cup of fermented mare's milk, a portable, nutritious staple. There was no distant depot to protect, no vulnerable line of carts stretching back to a homeland. The supply line was the army itself, moving at the same speed, living directly off the land it traveled through. This biological logistics train could traverse environments that would starve and stall a conventional force. They crossed scorching deserts by knowing where the hidden wells lay, navigated mountain passes with herds bred for hardiness, and pushed through frozen plains where their animals could dig through snow to find grass. This freedom of movement granted a strategic surprise that was almost supernatural to their enemies. A fortified city might believe itself secure, with scouts watching the main roads for an approaching army. But a steppe force could materialize as if from nowhere, having crossed a mountain range or a barren waste considered impassable, appearing at the walls from a direction thought impossible. It allowed a single command to strike targets hundreds of miles apart in a single campaigning season, creating a paralyzing illusion of being everywhere at once. The true innovation was not in creating a separate military logistics corps, but in never having needed one in the first place. Their way of life was their strategy. The very act of migration, of moving the community with the seasons, was a perpetual drill for moving an empire to war. When the order came to campaign, the entire society simply shifted its direction. The tents were packed onto carts, the herds were gathered, and the nation turned its movement from pasture toward conquest. This seamless integration meant there was no costly mobilization, no lengthy gathering of conscripts from their farms. The army was already assembled, already supplied, and already in motion. It was a form of power that was always ready, always moving, and therefore always a threat. Their mobility and coordination created a weapon far more powerful than any bow. The true target of the Steppe Empire's strategy was often not the city walls, but the minds of the people behind them. They mastered the art of psychological warfare, using terror not as a byproduct of conflict, but as a precise, calculated tool to shatter resistance before it could even form. This began with the sheer unpredictability of their movements. For a settled community, life followed a rhythm tied to the seasons and the harvest. An attack could come at any time from any direction. One season might pass peacefully, lulling a region into a false sense of security, only for a storm of riders to appear at the worst possible moment, when fields were ripe or a local festival had drawn people together. Rumors traveled faster than the armies themselves, each retelling amplifying the scale and ferocity of the approaching force. News of a distant city's fall, carried by frantic refugees, would arrive long before any scout spotted a single enemy rider. This created a paralysis of fear, a collective anxiety that eroded the will to organize a defense. The message delivered was brutally simple and intentionally clear. Envoys would arrive at the gates of a prosperous town or city, presenting a stark choice with profound consequences. The community could submit peacefully, offering tribute and formal recognition of the Khan's authority. In return, they would receive a guarantee of protection, not just from the army at their gates, but from any other rival power. Their lives, their property, and their way of life could continue, now under a new, distant overlord. The alternative was presented not as a battle, but as an inevitability. To refuse was to choose total obliteration. The stories of what happened to those who defied this offer were deliberately disseminated, ensuring that every city council and every defending soldier understood the potential cost of resistance. This was not mere brutality for its own sake. It was a chillingly efficient calculus. A long, costly siege drained an army's resources and momentum. A city that surrendered without a fight preserved those resources and added its wealth and productive capacity to the empire's strength. The terror was designed to make surrender seem not like cowardice, but like the only rational choice for survival. The psychological impact of this approach could unravel the strongest defenses from within. Imagine the scene inside a city that has received this ultimatum. The ruling elite debates while panic spreads through the streets. The professional soldiers may be ready to fight, but the merchants fear for their warehouses, the farmers for their families outside the walls, the priests for their temples. Unity fractures under the weight of the decision. Morale, that invisible glue that holds an army together, begins to dissolve before a single arrow is knocked. When the defending force looks out from the ramparts and sees not a disorganized horde, but a vast, silent encirclement of disciplined riders, their confidence turns to dread. They witness an enemy that moves with one mind, that seems to need no supply lines, and that possesses the patience to wait. This spectacle of overwhelming, alien power was often the final blow. Many gates swung open not because the walls were breached, but because the collective spirit of those inside was broken. The steppe empires understood that the most formidable fortress has one critical weakness: the human heart. By targeting it first, they could reshape borders not just through conquest, but through the sheer, daunting power of a reputation that marched ahead of them like an invisible army. Even the mightiest wall presented not an end, but a new kind of puzzle to solve. For all their brilliance on the open plain, the early steppe empires faced a glaring vulnerability: the formidable stone fortresses and walled cities of settled civilizations. A horse archer was a master of the field, but against towering ramparts and iron-bound gates, his arrows were little more than a nuisance. These citadels stood as arrogant symbols of permanence in a world of motion, seeming to declare that true power was rooted in stone, not in the saddle. For a time, these walls held. They created a stark boundary on the map, a line beyond which the steppe's influence seemed to fade. But to assume this was a permanent limitation was a fatal error. The nomadic mind, honed by adaptation to a merciless environment, viewed a weakness not as a permanent flaw, but as a problem awaiting a creative solution. When the Mongols, under leaders like Genghis and later his successors, encountered the immense fortified cities of China and Persia, they did not simply retreat in frustration. They initiated one of history's most rapid and ruthless campaigns of military learning. Their genius lay in recognizing that the knowledge they lacked was not a secret to be invented, but a resource to be collected. After each victory, even a minor one, they performed a grim but systematic inventory of captured personnel. Artisans, metalworkers, carpenters, and most importantly, military engineers who had served the defeated army were not executed or enslaved in the traditional sense. They were identified, separated, and offered a stark choice: serve the new empire with your skills, and you and your family will live and be valued. Refuse, and the consequence was the loss of everything. This policy of forced integration, brutal in its efficiency, allowed them to assemble a traveling academy of siege expertise literally overnight. A Chinese engineer who had once designed defenses for the Jin dynasty might find himself, within months, explaining the principles of counterweight trebuchets to Mongol commanders outside the walls of a Khwarezmian city. This was adaptation at a terrifying scale, turning the very tools of their enemies against their former masters. The result was the creation of a mobile siege train, a logistical marvel that brought the walled city onto the nomadic terms of warfare. Engineers and craftsmen traveled with the army, their wagons loaded not with grain, but with the components of destruction: pre-shaped timber for building siege towers, bundles of ropes, hides for covering battering rams, and forged metal parts for assembling artillery. They mastered the traction trebuchet, a fearsome weapon powered not by a heavy counterweight, but by a crew of men pulling in unison on ropes. It could be assembled quickly from prefabricated parts and was devastatingly accurate, hurling not just stones but later, containers of burning pitch or even diseased carcasses over the walls to spread terror and illness within. But their tactics went far beyond bombardment. They became adept at the slow, subterranean war of the sapper. Teams of miners protected by wooden sheds called cats would dig tunnels beneath the walls, shoring them up with timber as they went. Once deep under the foundations, they would fill the chamber with combustible material, set it ablaze, and collapse the tunnel. The burning supports would give way, causing a whole section of the wall above to crumble into the smoking pit below. They learned hydrology as a weapon, diverting rivers and streams to flood moats, undermine foundations, or even cut a city's water supply entirely. Perhaps most chilling was their tactical use of captured populations from surrounding areas. These individuals would be forced to march ahead of the Mongol ranks during an assault, acting as human shields to absorb the defenders' arrows and bolts, a harrowing tactic that placed the moral burden of killing their own people squarely upon the shoulders of those inside the fortress, crushing their will to fight. This relentless, multifaceted approach transformed a siege from a stalemate into a systematic, predictable process of reduction. A city that once expected to hold out for months or years until a nomadic army grew bored and left now faced an inexorable machine. Day and night the bombardment continued. The ground trembled from mining operations, the water turned foul or disappeared. From the parapets, defenders watched in horror as the enemy outside their walls worked with the disciplined efficiency of master builders, constructing ever larger engines and closing the noose with earthwork ramps and mobile shields. The psychological impact was profound. The wall, that ultimate symbol of safety, was now a trap. The steppe warriors had not just learned how to break stone, they had learned how to shatter the very idea of permanent security. The greatest innovation was not the trebuchet or the mine, but the nomadic capacity to absorb, repurpose, and deploy specialized knowledge from any source. They remained true to their core identity, a mobile force of horse archers, but they had now grafted onto it a complete, portable capability for positional warfare. The walled city, the medieval world's ultimate stronghold, was no longer a sanctuary. It had become merely the most difficult type of terrain they had yet learned to cross. And in learning to cross it, they erased the last geographical limit to their power, redrawing the borders of the known world not around natural features, but around the reach of their own relentless adaptability. This sprawling empire, stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, now faced its greatest challenge: communication. How could one man in a central camp possibly command armies separated by thousands of miles of mountains and deserts? The answer was not a stronger horse or a faster rider, but a system, a network of stations so effective it functioned like a medieval internet. The Mongols called it the Yam, and it transformed information into the most potent weapon in their arsenal. Picture a chain of way stations meticulously placed along every major route of the empire, each spaced roughly a day's ride from the next. These were not simple rest stops, but fully stocked logistical hubs maintained by local communities as part of their tribute. At any moment, a messenger bearing a tablet of authority from the Khan could gallop into a station, his horse lathered and spent. Within minutes, he would transfer his sealed dispatches to a fresh rider already mounted on a rested horse, who would then thunder down the road to the next station. The original messenger could rest while his information raced forward without pause. This relay principle shattered the old limits of distance. A single rider, no matter how hardy, would eventually need to sleep and his horse would tire. The Yam system eliminated those delays entirely. By constantly refreshing the carrier and the mount, urgent news and imperial orders could travel up to 200 miles in a single day, a speed that was simply unimaginable in medieval Europe, where a royal courier might cover 30 miles on a good day. This meant that a report from a general on the Russian frontier could reach the Great Khan's court in Mongolia in a matter of weeks, not months. Suddenly, the ruler had something approaching real-time awareness of events on fronts he would never personally see. He could learn of a victory, a rebellion, or a logistical problem while there was still time to react decisively. The system carried more than just military intelligence. It was the empire's circulatory system, moving administrators, diplomats, and merchants under official protection, binding the diverse conquered territories into a single, functional unit. The security of the Yam routes was paramount. Roads were patrolled and banditry was suppressed with brutal efficiency because an attack on a messenger was an attack on the state itself. This guaranteed flow of information created a profound strategic advantage. A commander in the field knew that if he sent a request for reinforcements or a warning of enemy movement, that message would get through and an answer would come back with stunning speed. This allowed for breathtaking coordination. Separate armies operating continents apart could time their campaigns to support one another, creating strategic pressure on multiple enemies simultaneously. The Yam was the nervous system that connected the decentralized, autonomous military units, the Tumans, to the commanding brain of the Khan. It provided the central control necessary to direct a machine built for independent action, turning a collection of powerful cavalry armies into a unified, responsive, and intelligent organism. While European kings struggled to govern realms the size of a single modern country, often unsure of events in their own provinces, the Mongol Khans received daily updates from the edges of Asia. This was not just an administrative tool, it was the ultimate expression of power, control over time and space itself, woven into the very fabric of their conquered world. Mobility was not just a tactic for them, it was the entire philosophy of power. This was the first and most sacred principle of steppe warfare, the doctrine that governed every other innovation. Every piece of equipment they crafted, every movement they practiced, was designed for one purpose: to remain in constant, controlled motion. The composite bow was a weapon of mobility, allowing lethal strikes from a galloping horse. The stirrup was a tool of mobility, granting the stability to fight effectively without ever stopping. Their horses were the embodiment of mobility, living engines that powered the entire system. This doctrine meant they rejected the very concept of a fixed battlefield. Why stand and fight on your enemy's chosen ground when you could dictate the terms of every encounter? Their strategy was to control the clock of the conflict. They would strike with blistering speed, then melt away, only to reappear 100 miles away the next week, attacking a target their opponents believed was safely behind the lines. This relentless tempo exhausted slower, heavier armies. A European force burdened by foot soldiers and supply wagons would march for days to reach a reported enemy position, only to find empty grassland. The men would be weary, their supplies dwindling, their morale sinking with each fruitless march. Then, just as they turned for home, the steppe cavalry would swarm their flanks, fresh and fully supplied, having spent the interim resting and grazing their horses. The psychological toll was immense. For the defending commander, it felt like trying to fight a shadow or to grasp a handful of smoke. Every conventional rule of warfare was inverted. Holding the high ground meant nothing if your enemy refused to come up the hill. Protecting your supply lines was impossible when your foe had none to attack. This doctrine transformed the vast, open geography of Eurasia from a defensive barrier into a personal highway. Rivers and mountain ranges that halted other armies became navigational waypoints for forces that traveled light and lived off the land. They could cross deserts considered impassable, using knowledge passed down for generations about hidden wells and seasonal grazing. This allowed for operations that seemed to defy the logic of the map. A city nestled deep within a kingdom, surrounded by friendly territory, could suddenly find itself isolated and under siege by an army that had, in essence, teleported across what were supposed to be secure borders. The goal in the initial phases of conquest was never to dig in and hold a patch of dirt. It was to create a state of pervasive, unpredictable threat, to shatter an enemy's sense of security and paralyze their ability to respond. By the time a settled kingdom realized it was at war, the Steppe Empire had already won the campaign of movement. The real borders were not drawn on parchment, but in the minds of those who lived in constant dread of the horizon, never knowing from which direction the storm would come next. This universal duty forged an army from the cradle. In the settled kingdoms of Europe or China, a soldier was often a peasant conscripted from his farm, handed a spear, and expected to learn the brutal trade on the battlefield itself. For the steppe tribes, the opposite was true. Military proficiency was the baseline of existence, a fundamental skill set woven into childhood. A boy learned to handle a bow almost as soon as he could pull its string, practicing first on small game to feed the family, his accuracy growing alongside his responsibility. Riding was not a leisure activity, it was the primary mode of transport, and herding the family's livestock across vast distances taught terrain awareness, endurance, and small unit coordination long before any thought of war. By the time he was considered a man, a young steppe male was already a veteran of 1,000 minor campaigns against the harsh elements and rival predators, both animal and human. This created a staggering strategic advantage, a deep, constantly renewing reservoir of skilled manpower that required no expensive state-run training camps. The entire society was the academy, and its curriculum was survival. This meant that when a Khan called his banners, he was not gathering frightened farmers. He was mobilizing a complete, pre-trained force where every individual already understood the language of signals, the care of horses, and the lethal mechanics of the composite bow. The army was not a separate institution. It was simply the community organized for a different purpose. This universality of service solved the chronic problem of military recruitment that plagued settled states, where rulers had to balance the need for soldiers with the need for farmers to work the land. On the steppe, those two needs were one and the same. The herds that fed the people also moved the army. The result was a force that could be raised quickly, sustained indefinitely, and was composed entirely of what other cultures would consider elite light cavalry. They were not professional soldiers, they were a professional martial culture, and that distinction made all the difference. Yet skill alone does not ignite the fire of conquest. What transformed this capable mass into an unstoppable engine was the powerful fuel of personal ambition. a social system where the path to wealth and honor was laid out on the battlefield. While medieval Europe often locked status behind hereditary titles and land ownership, the steppe empires operated on a powerful, pragmatic meritocracy. A warrior's standing was not inherited from his father's name, but earned with his own hands and his own courage. The rules were clear, transparent, and incredibly motivating. Bravery in combat demonstrated success in raids, and loyalty to one's commander were rewarded not with vague praise, but with tangible, life-changing prizes, a larger share of the plunder, a promotion to lead a small group of 10, then 100, then 1,000. This loot was not merely treasure, it was social capital, horses, weapons, silk, and precious metals that could elevate a man's entire family within the tribal hierarchy. A common herder could, through sheer prowess and proven judgment, rise to become a general commanding thousands, dining in the Khan's own tent. This system created a self-correcting leadership structure. Incompetent or cowardly leaders who got their men killed or missed opportunities for victory would not last long, as their followers would lose faith and their rewards would dry up. The most capable, charismatic, and successful warriors naturally rose to the top, ensuring that the army was always led by its sharpest minds and most determined spirits. This meritocratic ethos meant every warrior from the lowest rider to the highest general was personally, materially invested in victory. His performance on the field directly translated to his family's security, their wealth, and their prestige back in the communal camp. There was no such thing as a disengaged conscript simply serving his time. For the steppe warrior, war was not a duty to be endured. It was the primary avenue for social advancement, the one sure way to build a legacy. This created an army of stakeholders, each man fighting not just for a distant king or an abstract cause, but for a very concrete future for himself and his lineage. When you combine universal, lifelong training with a social ladder that can only be climbed through military success, you create a military culture of breathtaking hunger and resilience. It was a machine that ran on ambition, and it was always looking for the next horizon to conquer. Information was the sharpest arrow in their quiver, while other empires relied on scouts to report the size of an enemy army. The steppe powers perfected a deeper, more insidious form of knowledge. Their campaigns were not launched into the unknown. They were surgical strikes guided by a comprehensive map of their target's political and social landscape, drawn by a network of eyes that were everywhere and nowhere. Long before the first rider crossed a border, the intelligence apparatus was already at work. Official envoys traveled openly to neighboring courts, bearing gifts and messages, but their true mission was observation. They noted the construction of new fortifications, the mood of the populace, and the demeanor of the ruling elite. More covertly, merchants played a crucial dual role. A trade caravan was the perfect cover, its members moving freely through cities and along trade routes, listening to gossip in marketplaces, assessing the wealth of regions, and discreetly sketching the passes and fords that an army would need. These commercial spies reported on everything from harvest yields, which hinted at a region's ability to withstand a siege, to the grievances of local nobles who might be persuaded to switch sides. The most famous practitioners, the Mongols, elevated this to a science. They understood that a kingdom was not a monolith, but a fragile coalition of competing interests, rival nobles, ethnic minorities, and religious factions. Their agents sought out these fault lines with meticulous care. They might learn that a provincial governor felt slighted by the central court, or that a merchant guild resented high taxes, or that a distant cousin of the king believed the throne was rightfully his. This intelligence transformed abstract political tension into a tangible military asset. When the time came to attack, they did not simply invade a country. They executed a precisely tailored political operation. They would send secret offers to those disgruntled nobles, promising autonomy and wealth in exchange for their allegiance or, at the very least, their neutrality. They might launch their initial assault not at the strongest frontier fortress, but through the lands of a rival who had agreed not to resist. The effect was a form of strategic paralysis. As the steppe army advanced, the defending king would find his realm fracturing from within. Expected reinforcements would fail to arrive as local lords hesitated, negotiated for their own survival, or even openly defected. Supply lines would be sabotaged by populations who saw the invaders not as a foreign menace, but as potential liberators from a corrupt or oppressive central authority. This use of intelligence made their victories feel inevitable, as if the very ground was shifting beneath the feet of their enemies. A commander facing them wasn't just fighting an army, he was fighting the accumulated resentment and ambition of his own people, weaponized against him by a foe who had done his homework with chilling thoroughfare. The battlefield was won long before the first arrow was fired, in the quiet conversations of spies and the discontented whispers of a kingdom about to unravel from within. The most dangerous enemy is one who learns from you. While other conquerors sought to erase the cultures they overran, the steppe empires perfected a different art, the systematic absorption of talent. This was not a gesture of generosity, but a cold, calculated strategy for perpetual military evolution. Their greatest innovation may have been an open mind. After the smoke cleared from a sacked city, a peculiar selection process began. Soldiers would separate the population not by wealth or status, but by skill. A master carpenter who could build siege engines, a metalsmith who knew the secrets of strong alloys, a physician who understood battlefield medicine, or a scholar who could manage complex records. These individuals were not seen as prisoners. They were seen as precious resources, living libraries of technical knowledge. They were offered a stark but clear proposition: serve the new empire with your expertise, and you and your family will be protected and valued. Refuse, and you become useless. This policy of forced integration created a traveling university of warfare that moved with the army. Imagine a Chinese engineer who had once designed fortifications for the Jin dynasty finding himself, within a year, explaining the principles of counterweight trebuchets to Mongol commanders outside a Central Asian city he had never heard of. His knowledge, intended to defend one civilization, was now being used to breach the defenses of another. This constant influx of fresh intellect acted as a vaccine against stagnation. While a settled kingdom might rely on the same military textbooks and inherited traditions for generations, the steppe military was in a state of permanent, aggressive upgrade. Each conquest added new chapters to their manual of war. From the Middle East, they adopted advanced siege techniques and the terrifying Greek fire, an early form of napalm. From China, they eventually integrated gunpowder units and rocketry into their formations, blending the shock of new technology with their classic mobile tactics. They did not just copy, they adapted and improved, fitting new tools into their existing fluid doctrine. A Persian siege cannon was not just dragged into place, it was made mobile, pulled by teams of horses to keep pace with the cavalry. This pragmatic assimilation meant they were always one step ahead. The army you faced this year was not the same army you had heard stories about from a decade ago. It had learned, it had incorporated the best ideas of its last opponent, and it was now using those very ideas against you. Their power was not rooted in a single, static culture, but in a ruthless, ongoing process of intellectual scavenging. They built an empire not by rejecting the world they conquered, but by consuming its brightest minds and sharpest tools, turning every victory into fuel for the next. How do you defend against a force that grows stronger and smarter each time it wins? Long before the Mongols refined their system, the Huns revealed a different kind of power. Their innovation was not in building a lasting bureaucracy, but in weaponizing movement itself. They turned their entire society into a slow, unstoppable avalanche, pressing against the frontiers of the Roman world with a force that was less a single army and more a shifting climate of dread. Their strategy was one of constant grinding pressure. They did not always seek to conquer and govern territory in the traditional sense. Instead, they mastered the art of using mass migration as an instrument of invasion. The movement of their people, their herds, and their wagons across the landscape created a permanent crisis for the empires in their path. Imagine the Roman frontier commanders along the Danube River. Their duty was to guard a fixed line, a border marked by forts and watchtowers. But what do you do when the threat is not a rival army forming up for battle, but an entire nation on the move, settling just beyond the river? Its intentions unclear, but its presence overwhelmingly felt. The Huns did not announce a war with a declaration. They simply arrived, and their arrival was the conflict. Their primary military tool became the raid, a sharp, violent probe designed for a specific economic purpose, to extract wealth through tribute. A swarm of Hun cavalry would cross the river, strike a province with shocking speed, seize everything of value from livestock to gold, and then vanish back into the grasslands, often before a Roman legion could be mobilized to respond. The goal was not to hold the land they ravaged, but to bleed it. They perfected a form of parasitic warfare, weakening the Roman economy by constantly draining its resources and demonstrating the empire's inability to protect its own citizens. This created a devastating cycle. The more successful the raids, the more tribute Rome was forced to pay just to purchase a temporary, fragile peace. That gold, meant to buy safety, instead fueled the Hun Confederation, allowing them to attract more warriors and grow even stronger, which in turn demanded even greater tribute. It was a strategy that turned Roman wealth into the very weapon used against it. Their power was amplified by a terrifying reputation, a psychological weapon carefully cultivated. Stories of their ferocity, their seemingly inhuman appearance to Roman eyes, and their ruthless tactics raced ahead of them, sowing panic. This aura of terror was a force multiplier, often causing defenses to crumble before a single arrow was loosed. But perhaps their most significant innovation was political. The Huns were masters of confederation. They did not merely conquer rival tribes, they absorbed them, weaving a patchwork of Goths, Alans, and others into a loose but potent alliance under Hun leadership. This allowed them to command forces far larger than their own core population, presenting Rome with a hydra-headed enemy. One year they might pressure the frontier with one allied group, and the next, a different contingent would strike elsewhere, keeping the empire perpetually off balance. This model showed that reshaping borders did not always require permanent occupation. Sometimes it was enough to apply sustained, intelligent pressure at the weakest points, to manipulate rivals, and to make the cost of defense so high that the border itself became meaningless. The Huns proved that a mobile society could bend the map not by drawing new lines of control, but by making the old lines impossible to maintain. The Huns demonstrated raw, terrifying potential, but their power was often fleeting, built on fear and fragile alliances. To forge something truly lasting required more than momentum. It demanded a system. This is where the story reaches its breathtaking climax with the rise of the Mongols. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, the scattered innovations of the steppe were not just used, they were perfected, codified, and fused into the most formidable war machine the medieval world would ever see. Think of it as a grand synthesis, taking the composite bow, the hardy horse, the feigned retreat, and the meritocratic spirit, and forging them in the fire of a single, unifying vision. The result was not merely a larger horde, but a professional, cohesive institution that could think and act as one organism across continents. The first ingredient in this transformation was a radical new standard of discipline. Previous nomadic confederacies could be brilliant but chaotic, their unity dissolving as quickly as it formed after a campaign. Genghis Khan imposed a revolutionary legal framework known as the Yassa. This was not a vague code of honor, but a precise set of laws that governed every aspect of military life with brutal clarity. Desertion in battle was punishable by loss of everything. A soldier who failed to retrieve a fallen comrade's equipment faced severe penalty. Even minor infractions in camp, like drawing a weapon in anger, were dealt with harshly. This created a predictable, orderly environment where every warrior knew the rules and the dire consequences of breaking them. The Yassa eradicated the internal rivalries and petty feuds that had crippled earlier steppe groups, replacing tribal loyalty with a higher, impersonal loyalty to the law of the Khan and the unit. Discipline was then forged into instinct through relentless, standardized drilling. Mongol units practiced complex maneuvers for hours, not just as individual riders, but as coordinated parts of a vast whole. They rehearsed signal responses, formations for envelopment, and the precise execution of the feigned retreat until it became second nature. This drilling meant that in the fog of a real battle, a commander's orders were executed instantly and smoothly, turning the army into an extension of his own will. The meritocratic principle was hardened into an ironclad system. Promotion was based solely on proven ability and loyalty on the battlefield, with no regard for noble birth. A talented shepherd could rise to command 1,000, while the incompetent son of a chieftain would be passed over. This ensured that the army's leadership was always its sharpest and most motivated, creating a powerful engine of ambition where every soldier knew his performance could change his destiny. Then came the masterstroke, the system that tied this disciplined, ambitious body together, the Yam Communication Network. We have touched on its mechanics, but its true genius was in function. The Yam was the central nervous system for this new kind of empire. It allowed the great Khan, sitting in his mobile capital, to coordinate armies separated by thousands of miles of mountains and deserts as if they were in the same room. A general in Persia could send a request for instructions and receive a reply from Mongolia in a matter of weeks. This unprecedented flow of information enabled strategic planning on a scale previously unimaginable. Separate armies could launch simultaneous, coordinated invasions on multiple fronts, stretching enemies to a breaking point and preventing them from supporting one another. It was the difference between a collection of talented raiding parties and a single, intelligent global force. The Mongol Synthesis created something entirely new, a professional nomadic military institution. It could execute a complex, multi-year strategic plan across the entire span of Asia, moving with the fluidity of a nomadic force, but with the coordination and endurance of a settled empire's standing army. They were no longer just masters of the battlefield, they were masters of the map itself, capable of redrawing borders not through chaotic expansion, but through calculated, systemic conquest. This was the apex of steppe innovation, a machine so refined it could absorb the shock of any defeat and learn from every enemy, constantly evolving. But every apex is followed by a new challenge. By the 14th century, the world had learned the lessons of the Mongol storm. Fortresses were built higher and stronger, designed specifically to withstand prolonged bombardment and sophisticated siege tactics. The pure mobility of the classic steppe model now faced walls that refused to fall quickly enough. Into this hardened world rode a new kind of conqueror, Timur, known to history as Tamerlane. His genius was not in rejecting the nomadic tradition, but in supercharging it with a terrifying new ingredient, industrialized firepower. He represents the steppe tradition's next great evolution, shifting from pure mobility toward a devastating combined arms approach. Timur built his empire on the systematic, almost factory-like production and deployment of siege artillery. While the Mongols had used traction trebuchets built on site, Timur's armies traveled with massive prefabricated counterweight trebuchets and, more importantly, some of the earliest effective cannons seen in Central Asia. These were not mere noisemakers. His engineers constructed enormous bombards capable of hurling stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds, not just to damage walls, but to shatter them completely, reducing towers to rubble in a matter of days. This artillery train was a logistical marvel, moving with his army and setting up with practiced efficiency at each new fortress. The walls that had once provided security now became death traps for their defenders, collapsing under a storm of engineered stone and early gunpowder explosions. Yet Timur never forgot his roots. The artillery was never the whole army. It was simply the key that unlocked the gate. Once his bombards had blasted a breach, his true strength took over. The classic steppe cavalry, lightning fast and utterly disciplined, would flood through the opening to finish the conquest in the open streets and squares of the city. This was the combined arms doctrine in its rawest form, technology and tradition working in perfect, brutal harmony, but his innovations did not stop there. During his campaigns into India, Timur encountered another formidable weapon of war, the elephant. He did not see these creatures as mere curiosities. He saw their potential as a revolutionary battlefield platform. He incorporated war elephants into his forces, using them in ways that played to his strategic strengths. In battle, these armored giants acted as mobile fortresses. Their sheer size and terrifying presence could break enemy cavalry charges, as horses unaccustomed to them would often panic and refuse to advance. More cleverly, Timur used them as towering, moving archery platforms. Howitzers of flesh and bone, they carried towers on their backs filled with archers who could rain arrows down over the heads of friendly troops, providing suppressing fire during an advance. The elephants also served a profound psychological purpose, a symbol of immense, unstoppable power that could demoralize an enemy before the fighting even began. Timur's legacy is one of ruthless adaptation. He proved that the steppe military tradition was not a relic but a living system. When the world adapted with stronger walls, he adapted with bigger guns. When he encountered new tools in conquered lands, like the elephant, he found a way to integrate them into his existing machine. He moved beyond the model of overwhelming mobility alone, creating a balanced force that could crack any static defense with technology, and then exploit the breakthrough with the timeless speed of the horseman. This showed that the power to reshape borders was not a one-time event, but a continuous process of learning and synthesis. The steppe could innovate from within, absorbing the very technologies that were meant to stop it, and emerging more formidable than ever. Timur's synthesis of firepower and mobility was a glimpse of the future, but it was the Ottomans who would perfect this fusion. Emerging from the very heart of the steppe tradition, they became the heirs who carried its principles into a new age of smoke and iron. Their story is the ultimate testament to the adaptability of the nomadic military ethos, not by rejecting change, but by harnessing the most disruptive technology of their time, gunpowder, and bending it to their will. They began as a small principality on the fractured frontier of the Byzantine world, their leaders bearing the title of Ghazi, frontier warriors for the faith, their tactics still echoing the swift raids of their ancestors. But to build an empire that would last 6 centuries, they needed more than raiding parties. They needed a new kind of army, one that could crack the mightiest walls and hold the ground it took. Their first revolutionary step was the creation of a permanent, professional infantry corps utterly loyal to the state, the Janissaries. Recruited through a unique system from non-Muslim communities within the empire, these soldiers were raised from childhood to serve only the Sultan. They were the antithesis of the tribal cavalry, a disciplined, standing force of foot soldiers. As gunpowder weapons evolved from unreliable novelties into decisive tools of war, the Ottomans equipped their Janissaries with the most advanced muskets of the era. They drilled relentlessly in volley fire, a tactic that required iron discipline to maintain a continuous, rolling barrage of shot. This created a deadly, static firepower that could shatter the charges of even the most heavily armored European knights. Yet the Ottomans never forgot their roots. Alongside this new infantry, they maintained the Sipahis, a vast force of feudal cavalry granted land in exchange for military service. These horsemen were the direct descendants of the steppe tradition, providing the army with its swiftness, its strategic reach, and its crushing force in open battle. The true masterpiece, however, was in siegecraft. To conquer the legendary walls of Constantinople, which had repelled invaders for 1,000 years, Sultan Mehmed II commissioned the largest cannons the world had ever seen. One, known as the Basilica, was a monstrous bronze bombard so large it required a crew of hundreds and oxen to move it. It could fire a stone ball weighing over 1,200 pounds, each shot hammering the ancient Theodosian walls with earth-shaking force. This was not a single weapon, but part of a coordinated artillery train that subjected the city to a continuous, methodical bombardment for weeks. The mobile cavalry blockaded the city by land, while a hastily assembled fleet controlled the sea. The Janissaries formed the spearhead for the final assault. In 1453, the impossible happened. The walls fell. The Ottomans did not merely take a city, they ended an era. This victory was the product of their unique military synthesis. The steppe's mobility and endurance perfectly married to the transformative power of industrialized gunpowder warfare. For the next 3 centuries, this model made them the preeminent power across 3 continents. They redrew the map of Eastern Europe, pressing into the Balkans and to the gates of Vienna. They dominated the Middle East and North Africa. Their empire became the final and most enduring monument to the steppe way of war, proving that its core strength was never the horse or the bow alone, but a relentless capacity for adaptation. The heirs had not just preserved the legacy, they had built upon it, using new tools to achieve an old ambition, the power to reshape the world. The Hungarian knights must have felt a surge of triumph as they watched their enemies flee. King Bela IV had gathered one of Europe's most formidable armies, a massive host of armored knights and infantry, confident they could meet the Mongol threat head-on. They pursued the retreating horsemen with the full fury of a decisive charge, only to feel the ground turn to mush beneath them. The Mongols had lured them perfectly into a swampy area near the Sojo River, a terrain where heavy European cavalry was not just slowed but utterly crippled. The magnificent charge dissolved into a struggling, mud-choked confusion of men and horses, their greatest strength rendered useless in moments. This was the feigned retreat executed with clinical precision, the first move in a tactical symphony of annihilation. As the Hungarian forces regrouped in their fortified camp that night, believing they had at least secured a defensive position, a new horror began. From the far side of the river, hidden in the darkness, 7 Mongol stone-throwing catapults opened fire. This was not a technology born on the steppe, but one adopted from conquered Chinese engineers, and its use here was psychologically masterful. The bombardment was relentless, huge stones crashing into the camp, sowing chaos, destroying shelters, and breaking any sense of security. The Hungarians were trapped, their mobility gone, now under siege from a distance they could not hope to counter. Then, in the dead of night, the final act unfolded. While a detachment of Mongols maintained the bombardment as a terrifying distraction, the main force executed a silent, swift crossing of the river at a shallow ford they had scouted in advance. They moved not as a raiding party, but as the jaws of a trap closing with silent certainty. By dawn, the Hungarian camp was completely surrounded. The Mongols used their classic tactic of leaving a single, apparent gap in their encirclement, a feigned path to escape. When the desperate, exhausted Hungarians burst through this opening, they did not find freedom. They ran directly into a waiting kill zone where fresh Mongol cavalry units cut them down without mercy. The rout was total and devastating. The Battle of Mohi was not merely a victory, it was a demonstration. In a single engagement, the Mongols displayed the full, terrifying integration of their military system. The classic steppe tactic of the feigned retreat set the conditions. Adopted siege technology applied unrelenting psychological pressure, and the flawless night maneuver and encirclement delivered the final, annihilating blow. It was a lesson in how mobility, intelligence, and borrowed technology could combine to dismantle a larger, traditionally superior force. Mohi showed Europe that it was not facing a barbarian horde, but a thinking, adaptive, and perfectly coordinated military machine. The kingdom's army was shattered, and the path to the heart of Europe lay open, a border erased not by slow migration, but in the span of a single, bloody night. The shockwave from Mohi reached far beyond the plains of Hungary, a warning that echoed across continents. It was a prelude to an event that would shatter a civilization's sense of permanence. In the year 1258, the Mongol war machine, now under Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu, turned its full, evolved might toward the very heart of the Islamic world, the legendary city of Baghdad. For 5 centuries, this metropolis had stood as a beacon of knowledge and power, the seat of the Abbasid Caliph, a spiritual and political center whose walls were believed to be impregnable. Its confidence was its first and perhaps greatest vulnerability. The Mongols approached not as awed barbarians, but as master engineers of conquest, bringing with them a traveling academy of siegecraft learned from Chinese masters. They did not simply surround the city, they methodically constructed an industrial ring of destruction. Teams of engineers assembled massive counterweight trebuchets, weapons of terrifying range and power, while miners began their subterranean work. The bombardment was not sporadic, it was systematic, a continuous day and night hammering of stone against stone that chipped away at both the physical walls and the psychological fortitude of those inside. Yet the true siege was fought in the realm of the mind. Before the first stone flew, Hulagu sent a chilling ultimatum to Caliph al-Mustasim. The message was a masterpiece of psychological pressure, offering a clear choice that framed resistance as an act of suicidal folly. The Caliph could surrender, open the gates, and his people would be spared. If he refused, the message implied the consequences would be absolute. This was not a bluff, it was a promise backed by a reputation built over decades. To amplify the terror, the Mongols employed a harrowing tactic. They forced captured prisoners from surrounding towns to advance ahead of their own troops during assaults, placing the defenders in an impossible moral dilemma. Each arrow fired from the walls of Baghdad to protect the city now risked striking their own countrymen. This brutal calculus aimed to paralyze the will to fight, to turn defense into an act of anguish. When a section of wall finally crumbled under the relentless engineering assault, the end came swiftly. The city that had considered itself the center of the world was overrun. The aftermath sent a seismic shock through the Islamic world and beyond. The loss of life was profound, a tragedy that reshaped the region's demographic and cultural landscape for generations. In a blow that echoed through history, the Great House of Wisdom, a library containing countless ancient manuscripts on science, philosophy, and medicine from Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions, was destroyed. While accounts vary on the specifics, the loss of this knowledge represented an incalculable setback for human understanding. Furthering the strategic devastation, the intricate network of canals and dikes that sustained Mesopotamia's agriculture, a system built over millennia, was deliberately damaged. This was not mere vandalism, it was a calculated act of economic warfare, ensuring the region could not quickly recover or support future resistance. The fall of Baghdad was more than a military defeat, it was a symbolic cataclysm. It proved that no amount of historical prestige, spiritual authority, or architectural grandeur could protect against the new paradigm of warfare. The steppe machine had evolved from a force of nature into a thinking, learning entity that could dismantle civilizations brick by brick and idea by idea. It demonstrated that the power to reshape borders now included the power to erase centers of gravity, to turn capitals into lessons written in dust and memory. Gold and silk were not just luxuries, they were the fuel for the entire machine. The military innovations of the steppe empires were not ends in themselves, they were the sophisticated tools of a remarkably direct economic system. In a world where wealth was rooted in land and castles, the nomads measured prosperity in what could move. A vast herd of horses and sheep represented liquid capital, grazing and multiplying as it traveled. Precious metals, fine silks, and glittering gems were the ultimate portable assets, compact stores of value that could be carried on a saddle, traded across continents, or bestowed upon a loyal warrior in an instant. This created a fundamental difference in how war was viewed. For a settled kingdom, raising an army was a staggering expense, draining the royal treasury to pay soldiers and provision them, a necessary cost to defend static assets. For a steppe khan, launching a campaign was an investment, the opening of a new revenue stream. Warfare was the primary economic engine, the most direct and prestigious method of resource acquisition. A successful raid or the surrender of a wealthy city did not just bring glory, it brought a windfall of plunder and the promise of annual tribute, a regular infusion of wealth that would flow back to the heart of the empire. This cycle was self-perpetuating and incredibly motivating. The spoils of conquest were not hoarded in a distant vault. They were strategically redistributed, shared among commanders and warriors according to a strict meritocratic system. A fighter who showed exceptional bravery or skill received a larger share, perhaps a string of fine horses or bolts of Chinese silk. This tangible reward did more than make him wealthy, it bound him tighter to the leader who provided it, reinforcing loyalty and ensuring his enthusiastic participation in the next campaign. The entire society, from the greatest general to the lowest stable hand, had a vested interest in military success. The army was not a cost center draining the economy, it was the profit-making engine that powered it. This economic imperative created a relentless pressure for expansion. Stagnation was not merely a strategic pause, it was an economic crisis. Without the constant influx of tribute and plunder, the system of rewards would dry up, loyalty would fray, and the confederation could splinter. Campaigns were therefore as much about economic necessity as they were about ambition. This need for perpetual motion drove innovation forward at a breakneck pace. Why invest in developing a better bow or a more efficient saddle? Because even a slight edge in combat could mean the difference between a rich prize and a costly defeat, between a thriving, loyal following and a disgruntled, dispersing horde. The economic model turned every warrior into a stakeholder and every battle into a business venture with immediate dividends. It was a system that brilliantly aligned individual ambition with collective expansion, ensuring the war machine was always hungry, always looking toward the next horizon where wealth and honor awaited. Their conquests forged something unexpected, a highway for the human mind. While the military machine reshaped borders with force, its greatest legacy may have been the silent exchange it enabled. The vast, interconnected domains of the steppe empires, particularly under the Mongol peace, did not just move armies, they moved ideas. For the first time in history, a traveler could journey from the shores of the Mediterranean to the court of the Great Khan in China under a single, enforced stability. This era of safe passage, known as the Pax Mongolica, turned the ancient Silk Road from a perilous series of local trails into a truly continental thoroughfare. It was as if a cultural and technological superhighway had been laid across the spine of Asia, and the traffic flowed in all directions. This was not a planned cultural mission, but a direct byproduct of their military and administrative control. Secure routes meant merchants, diplomats, scholars, and artisans could travel with unprecedented confidence, their caravans carrying far more than silk and spices. In their saddlebags and memories were the blueprints of civilizations, Chinese innovations like papermaking, advanced printing techniques, and the magnetic compass began a westward journey that would eventually revolutionize record-keeping, literacy, and navigation in Europe. Persian astronomical knowledge, Indian mathematics, and medical texts from the Arab world traveled eastward, enriching other centers of learning. Even culinary exchanges occurred, with pasta making technology potentially moving from east to west. This relentless cross-pollination meant that a technological breakthrough in one corner of the world no longer remained a local secret for centuries. It could, within a generation, become a tool for an engineer or a ruler thousands of miles away. The steppe acted as a massive cultural transmission belt, accelerating the pace of global development. Their role as connectors created a new kind of power, one that shaped the future not by holding territory, but by enabling the flow of the very things that would make future territories powerful. The borders they redrew were not just lines on a map, but the beginning of a connected world where an idea from one continent could ignite a revolution on another. This invisible network of exchange became their most enduring conquest, setting the stage for a planet where no great innovation would ever be truly isolated again. The very success of the steppe empires forced the world to evolve. For every wall that fell, a new strategy was born in the minds of those determined not to be conquered again. The reshaping of borders was a dramatic event, but its permanence depended entirely on whether settled civilizations could learn the lessons written in their own ruin. They did not do so quickly, and the cost of their education was immense, but gradually a toolkit of counter-strategies emerged, born from painful observation and desperate innovation. The first and most obvious response was to build deeper, not just higher. Kings and emperors stopped thinking in terms of single, proud citadels and began constructing integrated networks of defense. Instead of one massive castle, they built chains of smaller, mutually supporting fortresses along vulnerable frontiers. These outposts could garrison rapid response troops, serve as early warning stations, and force an invading force to besiege each one in turn, bleeding its momentum and supplies in a war of attrition it was not designed to fight. In Eastern Europe, particularly in Hungary and Poland, this became a refined art. They created zones of fortified towns and earthwork defenses, turning entire regions into defensive labyrinths that slowed the steppe cavalry's advance to a crawl and robbed it of its greatest asset, the element of surprise. If you could not outrun them, you could force them to stop and dig. The second, more profound adaptation was to fight fire with fire, or more precisely, to fight horse with horse. The most successful states began to adopt the tools of their enemies. They realized that to counter lightning-fast raids, they needed their own mobile screening force. This led to the creation of specialized light cavalry units, often recruited from the very frontier regions most familiar with nomadic tactics. The most famous example is the Hungarian Hussar. Originally inspired by Serbian and Balkan light horsemen, and refined through centuries of conflict with the Ottomans, the Hussars evolved into a formidable hybrid. They wore lighter armor than a knight, could cover vast distances, and were experts at reconnaissance, skirmishing, and harassing enemy supply lines. They were not a direct copy of the steppe warrior, but a settled kingdom's answer to him, blending local knowledge with the essential principle of mobility. Other states, like Muscovite Russia, created entire frontier military classes like the Cossacks, who lived a semi-nomadic life on the steppe border and became masters of irregular warfare, effectively using the enemy's own playbook to defend the settled heartland. The final and often most decisive counter-strategy was to reform the infantry itself. The classic medieval army, with its focus on heavy knights supported by poorly trained peasant levies, was a recipe for disaster against the steppe. The solution was to develop disciplined, professional infantry formations armed with weapons designed to break a cavalry charge. The Swiss, for instance, became legendary for their pike squares, dense blocks of soldiers wielding enormously long polearms that presented an impenetrable forest of steel to oncoming horses. Similarly, the English longbowmen and later crossbowmen and handgunners from various states proved that concentrated missile fire could devastate even the most agile cavalry if those archers were protected by stakes, ditches, or disciplined pikemen. The key was combined arms, the integration of different unit types to cover each other's weaknesses. A formation of pikemen could hold the line while crossbowmen shot from behind them, and a reserve of heavy or light cavalry waited to countercharge at the critical moment. This required immense training, coordination, and often a shift away from feudal levies toward paid, professional soldiers who drilled together regularly. It was expensive, complex, and slow to implement, but it worked. The lesson etched into history was stark. To defeat a system built on speed and flexibility, you had two paths. You could embrace that mobility yourself, creating hybrid forces that could meet the steppe warrior on his own terms. Or you could develop a defensive system so deep, so costly, and so resilient that it could absorb the initial shock, weather the storm of arrows, and force a battle of endurance where your resources and fortified positions would eventually tell. The age of the steppe's unchallenged dominance did not end because their innovations failed, but because the world they had reshaped finally learned how to answer back. The map of Eurasia did not just change, it was fundamentally remade. This relentless pressure from the steppe acted as a colossal force of political and social gravity, bending the trajectory of kingdoms and forging new nations in the crucible of survival. The most visible monument to this reshaping was the Mongol Empire itself, a staggering contiguous realm that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. But its deepest legacy was not the empire's vast borders, which proved fleeting, but the profound reactions it triggered across the continents. In the forests of northeastern Europe, a small, obscure principality named Muscovy learned to thrive in the shadow of the Golden Horde. By skillfully managing its relationship as a tribute-paying vassal, Moscow's rulers gradually accumulated wealth and authority, positioning themselves as the indispensable intermediaries between the steppe khans and the other Russian cities. When the horde's power finally fragmented, it was Muscovy, hardened and centralized by centuries of this demanding diplomacy, that stepped into the void, absorbing its rivals and laying the foundations for the Russian state. The steppe did not create Russia, but it provided the relentless pressure that forged its centralized, autocratic character, a kingdom born from the necessity of facing the eastern horizon. Far to the west, the shockwaves of invasion forced a different kind of evolution. The repeated trauma of raids and the ever-present threat of a full-scale descent pushed European kingdoms toward a painful but necessary consolidation. Feudal fragmentation, with its patchwork of independent lords and weak royal authority, was a luxury they could no longer afford. To raise and fund the large, professional armies needed for defense, kings had to centralize power, streamline taxation, and build stronger state bureaucracies. The need to counter steppe mobility accelerated the military revolution that would eventually produce the disciplined infantry squares and potent artillery trains of the early modern era. In a very real sense, the pressure from the East helped forge the powerful, centralized monarchies that would come to define modern Europe. And in China, the Ming dynasty, having overthrown Mongol rule, confronted the past with stone and mortar. Their monumental project was the Great Wall as we largely know it today, a continuous fortified line of breathtaking scale. This was not merely a military barrier, it was a psychological and political statement, a permanent demarcation between the settled agricultural world and the nomadic steppe. It declared a border in the most absolute terms possible, an attempt to freeze the map and end the dialogue of movement and response. Yet even this colossal effort was a testament to the steppe's enduring power, for it consumed the resources of an empire, a permanent defensive tax paid to the memory of the Khans. The medieval world map, then, was not a static picture. It was a living record of tension, a parchment stretched and warped by the push and pull between two irreconcilable ways of life. Every fortified line, every centralized kingdom, every new power that rose from the frontier was an answer to the question posed by the horsemen of the plains. The borders we see in history books were drawn not in peaceful chambers, but in the dust of countless raids, the treaties of extracted tribute, and the silent, watchful fear of an empty horizon that might once again begin to move. Their shadow stretches far beyond the medieval map. The principles that allowed a rider on the plains to topple a walled city did not vanish with the last great Khan, they simply changed their form. The legacy of steppe military innovation is not locked in the past. It is woven into the very fabric of modern conflict, a timeless blueprint for how to gain and wield disproportionate power. Consider the concept of blitzkrieg, the lightning war that stunned the world in the 1940s. At its core, it was not about tanks and planes. Those were just the new horses and bows. It was about the same holy trinity: speed, surprise, and deep strategic penetration. Just as a Mongol tumen could appear hundreds of miles from where it was last reported, shattering an enemy's sense of security, mechanized divisions bypassed strongpoints, drove deep into enemy territory, and sowed paralyzing confusion. The goal was identical: to collapse an opponent's will and ability to resist before they could even understand the battle had begun. It was the feigned retreat and the envelopment, executed with internal combustion engines instead of hoofbeats. The echoes do not stop on the battlefield. Look at the command structure of a modern professional army. While hierarchies exist, the most effective units operate on a principle of decentralized initiative and trust in junior officers, a direct parallel to the autonomy granted to steppe commanders. A lieutenant on the ground today, like a Mongol officer leading a tumen, is expected to understand the broader mission and adapt to fluid circumstances without waiting for orders from a distant headquarters. This meritocratic ideal, where promotion is tied to proven competence and leadership under pressure, is the bedrock of modern military professionalism, a system that values ability over birthright, mirroring the social ladder of the steppe that a talented herder could climb with his bow and his courage. Even the psychological dimension of their warfare has found its contemporary counterpart. The steppe empires were masters of shaping the narrative before the first arrow flew, using terror and calculated offers to fracture an enemy's unity. Today, this art is formalized as psychological operations, or PSYOPS, a dedicated branch of modern militaries that uses information, perception, and influence to achieve strategic objectives, aiming to demoralize an adversary and persuade populations, often making physical conquest unnecessary. And just as the Mongols built their campaigns on meticulous intelligence gathered by merchants and spies, modern strategy is now inseparable from intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Satellites and drones have replaced scouts on fast horses, but the purpose is the same: to see the enemy's weaknesses, understand their political fractures, and strike where they are most vulnerable. Understanding these ancient innovations, then, is far more than an academic exercise in medieval history. It is a masterclass in the enduring nature of strategic advantage. It reveals that the most powerful force in history is often not the biggest army, but the most adaptable one. It demonstrates how a culture of relentless learning and assimilation, of turning every encounter into a lesson, can grant a seemingly weaker power an overwhelming edge. The steppe empires teach us that borders are not permanent features of geography. They are temporary agreements written in the shifting sands of capability and will. They show that the power to reshape the world does not always come from possessing more, but from thinking differently, moving faster, and learning more quickly than anyone else expects. In an age defined by rapid technological change and new forms of asymmetric conflict, their story is a timeless reminder that the next revolution in human affairs may not come from a laboratory or a capital city, but from the open plain of unconventional thought. From the composite bow to the Yam network, these were not isolated gadgets but parts of a living, breathing system. Each innovation fed into the next, creating a military ecosystem of astonishing efficiency. The bow gave them reach, the stirrup gave them stability, the horse gave them endurance, and the social meritocracy gave them relentless ambition. Together, they formed a machine greater than the sum of its parts, a holistic answer to the challenges of their world. This teaches us a crucial lesson about innovation itself. True breakthroughs are rarely about a single, magical invention. They are about the connections, about how new tools integrate with old traditions, social structures, and grand strategy to create something entirely new. The Steppe empires mastered this integration, weaving technology, tactics, logistics, and psychology into a single, seamless fabric of power. They did not merely raid their neighbors. They engaged in a long, deliberate process of reshaping. They moved borders not by accident but by design, applying sustained pressure that broke old kingdoms and forged new ones in the fire of necessity. Cultures collided and merged in their wake, trade routes were secured and expanded, and knowledge was forced across continents at an unprecedented pace. Their legacy is etched into the political map of Eurasia and the very DNA of modern warfare. Their story quietly challenges a comfortable assumption, the idea that civilized warfare is defined by set peace battles and heroic stands. They presented a different, brutally effective model, one that prized fluidity, intelligence, and strategic patience over raw confrontation. In doing so, they remind us of the most profound power any society can possess, the power to adapt. To look at a wall, a desert, or a rival army and not see a barrier but a puzzle waiting for a creative solution. Their echoes are all around us in the speed of modern strategy and the value of decentralized command. If this deep dive into the engines of history resonated with you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the past. And we would love to hear your perspective. Which steppe innovation, from the humble stirrup to the vast yam, do you believe was the most revolutionary? Share your thoughts below.